All right. All right. Well, today we're in the studio of Felix D'Eon in Mexico City, in Colonia San Rafael, which is one of the more distinctive colonias of the city. I think it's like the second suburb of El Centro, and there's a lot of fascinating architecture, and this space is part of that. It's from the Portuguese era, so this is a very artistic area and a very family-oriented area, and has resisted gentrification for the most part. There's some signs of gentrification in the area, but I'm super excited to be here with Felix. I'm getting why all of a sudden would I be nervous after talking to you? But I'm very excited to sit down and get an opportunity to talk to you about your artwork. You're participating in the Existimos show, and we were connected through a friend, Martin, and Felix's work is very distinctive in that he is a master at blending different cultural aspects of the Mexican culture and his experiences as a queer artist, and the many different avenues that you take in your artwork. Some of it is definitely more queer oriented. Some of it's more oriented towards the. I'm going to end up saying it wrong. Can you tell me the root culture?
Mexicayo.
Mexicayo. Okay. Felix, we're repeating a little bit here, but how long have you been in Mexico City?
I moved here 8 or 9 years ago.
8 or 9 years ago, okay.
Yeah.
And you grew up in the suburbs of Los Angeles and spent much of your adult life in San Francisco, working as an artist in San Francisco as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Can you give a little bit of family background for us?
Yes. My father is U.S. of French descent, mm-hmm. and my mother is a Mexican. She's from Cocula, which is in Los Altos de Jalisco, mm-hmm. From a little town. And her mother was Huira, which is a tribe like Huirarica, mm-hmm. from the very, very far north of Jalisco. So my mother was an undocumented immigrant when she went to the U.S.
Okay.
And I grew up in the suburbs of LA, and now I live in Mexico.
Great.
Yeah.
And did you go to school for art? Did you study art, or?
I did. I went to the San Francisco Art Institute,
okay.
In San Francisco, and also the Academy of Art University in San Francisco also.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Bachelor's and master's degree, or just
no,
bachelor's?
Just bachelor's. I was 3 years at one school and then 2 years at the other.
Okay.
I got my bachelor's.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Felix, what are some of the primary themes that you work with in your artwork?
Well, I have two different bodies of work. So, like the primary, I don't know how to say which one is primary and which was not actually, but like one body of work is really wrapped around being queer. So the work is very inclusive, mm-hmm. and it's really about representation. So it's like that body of work is I'm a really good mimic of styles, mm-hmm. and so I make all of these paintings that look like they're vintage, like they were painted 100 years ago, like 1920s children's book illustrations or 1950s comic books or 18th century Japanese, Edo type paintings, and except that I'm telling queer stories, which initially were mostly stories like I'm a cisgender, Latino gay man who's white passing, and so initially my paintings were either telling like stories about white or Latino gay men.
Right.
But over time I decided that my work needed to be more inclusive, and so it's like. So now I try to be as inclusive as possible. So it's like usually queer themes, but every now and then of themes that are about like women's empowerment or body positivity, mm-hmm. But mostly usually in a queer direction. But the work is about making paintings that look like these vintage style paintings, but telling stories that would not have been told in the past.
Right. I think that's one of the things I really appreciate is it's like when I look at your work, I feel like my experiences are a part of history, and I don't get to see that very often. In history books, definitely you don't see that, but even within the gay culture, we don't see that very often. It feels like everything started with Stonewall and then happened afterwards, yeah. And that's documented very well.
Yeah.
But in terms of contemporary, looking backwards, the styles are really striking. Can you tell me a little bit about your definition of what it means to be queer?
Kind
'Cause that's a very broad.
That's a very broad. I think basically, it's like if you're not heteronormative, like I don't know. It's just not being. I honestly don't know how to define it. In my opinion, it's like when I use that word, I tend to mean like basically non-heteronormativity. So it's like that could involve, in my opinion, things like a cisgender man and woman, where the woman is the dominant, like she has a strap on or something with a guy.
Okay.
And then for me, that's the only context in which I will paint straight sex is where I feel like the woman has the power.
Right.
Because to me that makes the sex queer, and I don't know how to that's such a difficult word. I don't even know how to. I feel like I should know better how to describe it. But for me, it's like it's basically that. It's like taking things outside of the context that you're already used to seeing it.
Sure.
So it's like for me, the most common context would be like straight white people, and then like beyond that, everything starts to become more and more something that would not be represented. And I tend to use the word queer to describe that, because it's like queer can be like a person could be, gender fluid, and I don't know. I don't know how to describe it. It's like it's so all-encompassing that I don't know how to describe it.
Well, I think that's the sort of the perspective that I take with it as well. A lot of people will ask, well, I'm not, or they'll say, well, I'm not queer enough to be in your show or to participate in this. And I'm like, well, let's talk about like what that really means to you, because in my perspective, well, queer for me in the 80s and the early 90s was about politics. It was about being vocal and an activist. And then I stopped using the word, and then I started using it again when Trump was elected, because I felt like, well, I don't think it's a good time to play it safe. I think it's important to be visible. It's important to create opportunities for alternative voices that aren't going to get represented by the mainstream, the stories, the.
And I think maybe that's what I mean by when I personally use it is like alternative voices. It's like because it's like. I'm making paintings that are inclusive, and like if they're not necessarily like I'm not painting gay men, I'm not painting queer women, I'm not painting I'm painting like a variety of things, like trans people, gender fluid people, like a variety of body types, like kinds of sex that maybe are like not traditionally accepted, all this whole like maelstrom of like. Of sexy beauty is like what I want to represent,
right?
And I consider that whole thing queer, because it's not like heteronormative and whatever that is.
And you have an entire entire wardrobe room, closet full of costumes and various things. I've always been very curious about like the process of how you work with your models and how these images come together, because then you use those photos that you take. And you create your paintings and illustrations from those. Well,
things happen in a variety of ways, but like the ideal way is that, like for example, whenever I go to New York or San Francisco or something like that, there's less diversity in Mexico City, which is why I'm saying New York and I'll arrange with models before I go and be like, oh, I've never drawn a gender fluid Pakistani person before, and and I'll meet somebody like that in New York, and then we have like a long conversation, and I'll be like, okay, tell me about your experience and how you want to be seen in a work of art, because so we'll talk about different parts of, in this hypothetical example, Pakistani culture and what it means to be a gender fluid person there, and like where they can picture, because basically what I want is for people to see themselves reflected in works of art.
Okay.
And usually, I feel completely 100% confident doing that when it's about a Mexican experience or like a white European U.S. experience, because it's like that's my experience, and so it's like I can picture that easily. But if it's a different experience than that, I really need to talk to somebody, because it's like they will tell me like what they've seen. For example, I had a model who was a black guy from the South, and he was telling me how he was baptized in. He's like a Christian of some sort, and they were wearing these white outfits, and when he was a teenager, and like the white outfits became see-through in the water, and he thought it was crazy homoerotic, and he had this whole experience of like this baptism and the eroticism of the see-through clothes because of getting baptized that I never ever would have thought of, and it's a super great idea for a painting.
Right.
And it totally is completely dependent upon the context of people who have lived through it and can tell me about what it is that they think is like what they want to see. Like I've never actually done that painting because it's tricky. I need to have like black models wearing white clothes. It's hard for me to imagine what that would actually look like technically.
Right.
But like at some point that's going to happen, and I'm going to arrange when I meet the right models to do that photo shoot and make that painting. And so that's what happens. It's like I meet the model, we have a conversation, they tell me how they want to be represented, and then I take a bunch of photos, usually nude. If they have the clothes that reflect whatever it is that they want, that's best. Mm-hmm. And then I do it with those, and then I make a painting.
So I'm curious about like the response that you get from your models about the work that you produce as well, because we were talking before about this idea of like cultural appropriation, and there's definitely a long history of that kind of thing happening. So I'm curious how they respond back to you about the work that you produce and how that changes what you do as you move forward too.
Well, that's why the conversations are so important. Because I think that if I was like just making paintings of a variety of queer or ethnic experiences that I don't personally have,
right?
Like I would be for one thing, I'd be opening myself to mistakes of maybe doing racist things that I didn't even know were racist, because I just was too like caught up in my own head to realize that something was wrong. Right. And also, I would be imposing my own vision on different people. So it's like I feel like cultural appropriation is complicated. I don't think it's as easy as people sometimes think. It's like that you just can't automatically ever touch something that belongs to another culture. Right. I think that you can, but when you do, it requires a great deal of respect and knowledge, mm-hmm. And love about the way you're doing it. So it's like. In my particular case, with this particular body of work, it's like half of what I do is like related to my own culture. It's like I still make paintings that have to do with Latino themes regularly, but even then, it's like the question of cultural appropriation comes in, because it's like I'm not a lesbian, for example. It's telling me that I have an appointment with you. Let me turn off. So what I'm saying is that I feel like when you approach the people from the culture that you want to represent and get their permission, mm-hmm. and do it with respect, then you can make something that's really meaningful. So it's like the models know what I'm going to do beforehand because I got the permission, right. And we had a conversation about it to make sure I didn't make any mistakes, and for the most part, I don't think I have. It's like every now and then I'll post something, and somebody will get upset about something, but
it's almost kind of impossible.
It's impossible for that not to happen. I haven't had that happen yet.
I mean, if you put yourself out there, somebody's going to see something and turn it into something else. Like the interpretation of things, yes, particularly in social media, is so open. Yes,
yeah, exactly. So that's happened where like somebody takes something wrong. Like for example, an example which actually comes from my own culture is I repainted the Loterias deck. Right. And one of the cards is a trans man, and I call the card El Trans. Mm-hmm. And a U.S. White trans guy got really mad at me, and he left me this whole long comment where he was like, using the article of Ed, it's like the trans, and you're like, objectifying us, and he had this whole thing, and then. And a bunch of Latino trans people came to my defense, and they were like, well, actually, every single card in the deck says "el" or "la." It's like, if it didn't say that, it wouldn't really, fit into the structure of the game. Right. And I'd also think that maybe the person who said that didn't realize that I was Latino. And, but so, I don't know, things happen every now and then where it's it's impossible to keep everybody happy all the time. Right. Because at the end of the day, we're all individuals. But mostly, I feel like my work does walk that line of being respectful to whoever it is that I'm representing, and it's definitely my intention. It's like when it doesn't read that way to somebody, it was a mistake. Right. And then I'm like, and I am more than happy to, it hasn't happened yet, but if it ever does happen, I will destroy a work of art if I need to, because I went the wrong way and I'm offensive inadvertently or whatever, because it's that can definitely happen.
Well, and so much of the process of working with a model and everything that happens after the model is gone like, there's this level of trust that comes with it. So you have to maintain a relationship of trust.
Yes.
And sometimes that means, backing off and saying, okay, well, this didn't work out the way that I intended to, and learning from the situation. So I think that's really important.
Exactly.
The other vein of work that you have is specifically related to the cultural heritage of your family.
Yes.
And here in Mexico. Can you tell us a little bit more about that part of your work?
So the whole other body of work is like that's also related to my identity. So although that's a harder road, but like my grandmother is Ouida, like I had said earlier, and but I didn't grow up. So like I think like being Mexican usually means that you have Native American ancestors. For most of us, not all of us. Being Mexican is like a wide range of possibilities,
right.
But like I'd say like 90%, and most of us as Mexicans or Mexican Americans don't know what that background is. It's like we've lost it over time. It's like that's like the legacy of colonialism. So it's like one or two generations in a city, and you forget your like the language that your ancestors spoke. You might even forget what that tribe was. So it's like I feel lucky that I actually know what tribe my grandmother was,
right.
But my grandmother didn't speak that language. She was taken away from her Ouida family and given to like a non-indigenous Mexican family and raised by them. So it's like, so even in her generation that had already been lost. It's like, so I feel like I was raised in this very conventional Mexican ways, like a super like Catholic small town, kind of like a small town folkloric Catholicism.
Okay.
And growing up, I lost that in large part for being gay and partly just going to college and not believing in those things anymore. But I was left with that desire for that kind of spirituality.
Particularly like in the United States, because everything gets mollified into Catholicism as we know Catholicism. Here in Mexico, I've had many experiences where I've seen these blendings of ancient cultures, and this is part of that character of Mexico that I was talking about before, where Mexico is very open to absorbing other cultures, but it also keeps very much its own personality on things too. So if you could explain that ideal of folklore.
Mexican Catholicism is not like U.S. Catholicism. It's a different thing. So it's like, well, like for example, Day of the Dead. That's like a manifestation of Mexican Catholicism which comes directly from our pre-Hispanic roots.
Right.
So it's like U.S. Catholics don't believe that the dead come back and like hang out with you and have a party and like, it's like there's this whole system of beliefs in Mexico where they're very like magical realist. It's like Day of the Dead is not like Coco. Coco turned it into this bingo thing where it's like what really what the belief here, which is the belief that my family I grew up with, is that like the dead literally come back on that day and they go to your house and they're present with you on the night of Day of the Dead. And like you leave out their favorite food and the dead, I think this belief is so beautiful. They smell it because the dead eat by smelling. And there's a belief that if you were to eat that food, it would have no flavor because the dead already ate it. So there's all of these I just find them poetic and beautiful beliefs. Like for a while I lived in Juchitán in southern Mexico, and a belief there, they would leave a jicara of water by the grave and a comb and soap because the dead were dirty when they when they came back. I love that. So it's like there's all of these like kinds of beliefs, which is around like demons and angels and like praying to saints, and like there's one saint that you can pray for lost things, and if he doesn't give it back to you, you put a statue upside down in a drawer in the dark to punish him until you get it. Things like that, and that's how I grew up. And I think it's in some ways it's beautiful. In other ways, it was very like patriarchal, very conservative, very homophobic. So it's like all of those negative things are for me wrapped up with this traditional Mexican Catholicism in a way that they cannot untangle in my brain. So like to this very day, I find it beautiful. I love going to traditional like village saints ceremonies, and like all like Mexico's just filled with festivities, and usually they're wrapped up with Catholicism and this particular kind of Catholicism, and I love it. It's beautiful, but it has this underlying strain of misogyny and all of this other stuff that I just cannot handle. So well into adulthood, I discovered Mexicayo, which is this, it's like a revival, although most practitioners would say it's not a revival, it's something that survived since the ancient past, and there's arguments both ways. And it's like a spiritual practice that honors the traditions of our pre-Hispanic ancestors. So like in my mind, it's like an anti-colonial thing. It's like it's a way of like recapturing my spiritual heritage, but doing it in a way that isn't like Catholic, that doesn't have those Catholic values, and that isn't and that is like a project in decolonization.
Okay.
And the work that I'm making is about that. So I actually practice Mexicano. So it's like I wear traditional regalia. I go and do dances. I've been learning how to work with incense, and like all these are traditional things that have been handed down, and they're like there's a specific way to do it. It's like part of a living tradition. And my work is about, and the other part of my work is about that. It's about exploring what that means, like how to give it the respect that I think it deserves, you know. And that part is like.
Are you able to recontextualize it like through the queer lens though too? Because
yes.
I mean, you're queer, and you have this entire body of work that's very related to queer, particularly with sexuality. And I would imagine that your interpretation of it, even though you study it and you bring authenticity to it, sort of in an anthropological way, how does it change through your queer lens too?
Well, I mean, Mexico is basically as homophobic and conservative as most of the rest of the world, you know. So it's like many practitioners of the Mexicano religion bring that to it, and they're homophobic too. However, many do not, and there's no reason for it to be there, because it's like if you look at pre-Hispanic sources, it's like they're like the way sexuality was constructed was totally different than the European way, and there is a space that is part of traditional thought in Mexico. I'm talking pre-Hispanic, that is absolutely queer friendly. You know, it's like queer is like, you know, like these words are all difficult to use because it's like there's no gay, there's no queer, there's no like trans. Like all of these are modern concepts. The pre-Hispanic concepts are different. It's like there's like people who are like who have, there's more than one gender is a thing. It's like, but the genders are different than the genders we believe in today. It's like a different way of constructing it.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, it's like modern queer identities and pre-Hispanic queer identities. Like I feel like they can kind of like come together, and because like when I said that there's no trans, it's like I don't want to imply that that's something new, but it's like so for example, it's like when you're, and this is still true in certain tribes in Mexico, like the Zapotec. It's like if you have your children and one of them seems kind of gay to you, like basically that child becomes a third gender. Like there was no concept of like a trans woman being a woman from the beginning. Like that concept didn't exist.
Right.
But there was a different concept, which is that if a young person starts to manifest different like gender traits, I'm not sure if I'm using the words right, then that person would be this other gender. So like one of the words for this is siwayolotl, which means heart of a woman. And that would be for somebody who was assigned male at birth, who starts to develop traits that are more associated with the female gender, but they're not considered women. They're considered this other gender, a third gender. And so then when you grow up, you would wear women's clothing and do women's work and stuff like that, but you're not a woman. You're a siwayolotl. And like a person who is what we would consider gay, but cisgender, there's no such thing as gay. It's like what we consider a cisgender man could have sex with a siwayolot woman or a cisgender woman, and it doesn't affect his sexuality.
Right. Okay.
You know, so it's like it's about.
That's an interesting contrast to the misogyny of the culture too.
Yes, because it was misogynistic and it was patriarchal.
Right.
There were plenty of things that were bad. There was slavery. You know, there were like things that were bad, but like it's just different. You know, so it's like the way I like to look at the past is like. There's also a tendency among many practitioners of Mexicano to be like, oh, the past was perfect, and they were like, you know, highly evolved beings and everything. And I also feel like that's wrong, like because that takes away the humanity of our ancestors. It's like no one is perfect. Everyone has something wrong. Every culture has something wrong that needs to be fixed. That's just the way it is. Our culture has all kinds of things that are terrible, and our culture has all kinds of things that are really great.
Right.
And for me, like this whole thing is about looking to the past and finding the things there that I think are deeply profound, a way for me to approach the world through a spiritual lens and to understand it in a different way and bring the wisdom of our ancestors into our world, while also acknowledging that there were plenty of things about the past that in no way should come back.
Right.
And that were like really bad, you know. So it's like one of my favorite ideas about pre-Hispanic faith, which is, when I say pre-Hispanic, I should Mesoamerican faith. I'm going to use that word from now on, because it's like these ideas existed in the past and they still exist today. It's like Native American tribes throughout Mexico continue to believe in different manifestations of these ideas. But like, so one of them is the idea of sacrifice, which is, you know, this like really like this thing that like Western media loves to, like, oh, you know, like Aztecs ripping the hearts out of virgins and all that kind of thing.
Even, you know, sort of.
Yeah, it's like it's so easy to like make really scandalous, but actually the idea behind it is profound, and I think it's one of the most important ideas that our ancestors had that we do not have, that we desperately need. And the idea behind it is that for example, like if I get to eat a ear of corn, it's like there's a god of corn. But there's no word for God in Nahuatl. It's a different word, because it's like the word for God is Teotl, and that's how it's usually translated as a god. But if you think about gods in the Western context, like say for example the god of the ocean, Poseidon. The god of the ocean controls the ocean, but he isn't the ocean. Like he's apart from the ocean. The same way, like the Christian God created the world, but he exists apart from the world. The Teteo, or the Teotl, is the same as the thing that they control.
Okay.
So it's like an ear of corn is itself a god. And when you eat an ear of corn, the god is sacrificing himself for you. So it's like he literally becomes your flesh, and your body is him. And the only way for us to live is by consuming sacrificed gods who are dying for us. And then we live in a compact of sacrifice with them. It's like they sacrifice for us, so therefore we are required to sacrifice and give back to them. And like that was taken literally in the sense of like actual sacrifices. But I think metaphorically, it's like we live in a capitalist society that is all about individuality and individual happiness. And it's all about consumption. And it's not about sacrifice at all. And we are literally destroying the planet.
Right.
So like I feel like this philosophical idea of sacrifice is being the underpinning of all existence. The idea that like an ear of corn is suffering, like literally suffering, because the ear of corn isn't a thing, it's a god with agency, thoughts, and feelings.
Right.
And when you're eating it, it's suffering for you. And looking at the world that way and feeling like everything in the world is a spiritual manifestation of something that is beyond us, and that we are tied to that in this inextricable way, I think that makes the world feel like a part of yourself in a way that requires protecting.
Responsibility.
Responsibility and sacrifice.
Which is something that we don't see necessarily in modern culture. Yeah, I mean, that level of respect isn't really a part of the modern culture. And you were saying a lot of artists don't really address the depth of the ideal. They stay on the surface of things, and I think that's also a part of, because we are such a consumer culture, that we forget the responsibility of being a creator of culture is more profound, and it has more responsibility to it, and it requires a more thoughtful approach. Which is that's one of the reasons when you introduced this other thread of work, which I had never seen of yours before, I was like, well, this is an interesting divergence from the queer sexuality angle of things into a whole different area. And I was like, where's this coming from? Like, what is the, and I knew you were from the United States, and so my first thought was like, oh, is this cultural appropriation, or because I didn't know enough about your history too, so I was curious about it.
Yeah. So but when it comes to that, it's like it's not cultural appropriation because it is my culture. However, that's where it becomes complicated, because it's like my background is Huira, but this is Mexica,
right?
Which is a different tribe. So that's like, but like for me, it's like most Mexicans don't know what their background is, but we are Native American. That is where we come from.
Right.
That background describes and gave birth to Mexican culture. So in my opinion, it's like the Mexica don't exist anymore. They're gone. But like this way of celebrating spirituality, I think, is a way for people who have been ripped from our ancestry by the trauma of colonialization, and to be able to embrace a new kind of Native American spirituality, which belongs to us. It's ours by right. But it's like, not everybody could, like, I didn't personally end up like learning Wida or embracing Wida culture, in part because I was in the US when I started on this process, and I didn't know any.
Right.
Like, it wasn't open to me. But Mexica dance was. And now that I'm in Mexico, I feel like if I were to go back towards Wida culture, it's like I'll be coming at it from an outside position, because it's like it's a very, very living culture. It's like, whereas when I'm coming to the Mexica culture, I feel like I'm coming into it the same way most other dancers are too, where it's like we're coming to it creatively, searching for this way to like decolonize ourselves and to find connection with our roots and our ancestors.
Right.
And so it's like, the question of cultural appropriation is funny. And like, I'm aware of the strangeness of the optics of me with like blue eyes and everything doing what I do. But it's like I'm mixed race and white passing. There's nothing you can do about that. However,
and that's humanity too.
Yeah.
I mean, like it's this sort of like I don't know, like white supremacy or something. This ideal, this genetic ideal that we're not all mixed already. Like we get separated by culture and class and all these different areas and everything. So I realize that some people approach it and they're not genuine or sincere in the way that they approach it. So it's good to understand the process that you go through and how what your experience of it is as well.
What I was going to say to that though is that I can't be accused of cultural appropriation because it's my culture. But I think that if I was just like a white guy from the US and I had decided to approach what I'm doing with the same level of knowledge and respect and permission and all of the other things that I've been bringing to it, I think that would be fine.
Right.
It would be weird because like, why did this white guy decide to like connect to this particular culture that way? But weird doesn't mean make it bad.
Right.
So it's like.
Well, weird is another way to say queer as well.
That's true. So it's like my feelings about cultural appropriation are complex, So it's like, I definitely think it's a real thing and it can be a real problem, but there's also ways to approach it which are not.
Right.
But it requires a lot of work on the part of the person who's doing it, in my opinion.
I agree. I want to talk about like the current state of the world. It's 2020. We've been in a quarantine for a majority of the year. Your work, in particular, working with models, and there's sort of this celebration aspect to your work and this joy and everything. So I'd imagine in these times it's become very complicated for you in terms of just you can't coordinate things the way that you would normally coordinate them. Your models are not available to you. Can you talk a little bit about how you've been surviving the quarantine and maintaining your discipline, your creativity as well?
Well, we've been basically quarantined. I haven't seen very many people since it started. Like in the recent past, we've been a little looser and like having like social distanced barbecues on the roof with like 2 people or something. Like not parties, but like 1 or 2 friends who come over that I more or less trust for how they're like viewing the pandemic.
Right.
So there's no more models. But honestly, I have so much work planned from before. Where I've had photo shoots that I took 2 years ago that I still haven't painted because I just have so much. Like every time I go to the U.S., I'll arrange like photo shoot after like 3 or 4 photo shoots a day, and because I'm basically 2 artists making 2 bodies of work, it's like I'm always behind in my own head. This is all like self-generated.
I understand.
I have no like deadlines. This is just me. But like, so like basically, it's like I've just been like really hyper productive, and like it pushed like the pandemic pushed me into overdrive. It's like I've been painting a book. I've been writing and painting a book, which tells the story of the creation of the universe according to the Mexica.
Okay.
And I've been working on it for like 10 years. It's this massive project that's like 150 feet long.
Wow.
And but I was like lazy about the part of like bringing it to the point where I could actually share it. Mm-hmm. And the pandemic pushed me over that. I've been publishing it in chapters every month on Patreon, and I've been like that's one of my ways that I've been making a living while this is happening.
Sure.
And, so it's like it's just been like uber productivity. I've been really, really productive.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been productive, but I've also have sort of I keep having to switch because I consider myself more of an introvert. And so I thought, oh, pandemic, this isn't going to change anything for me. But then I realized I'm like, oh, I'm used to having like, an artist visiting and working in a studio. I'm used to having like maybe 2 social events a week where, 10 people sit around the table and we talk. And without all those inputs, I was just sort of like, oh, I'm feeling a little strange. I don't know what's going on. How do I maintain my drive? So.
I agree.
I mean, it feels like a chess. Like you're moving things around all the time, and you've literally moved. In the midst of a pandemic.
That helped my sanity a little bit, honestly. It's like I just felt like I was like going crazy, like in my apartment that we never left, and I was just like every day I was just feeling more and more desperate to just like, I need like something different.
Yeah.
And like the move helped a lot because like now we have a rooftop garden. Well, we're gonna have a rooftop garden soon, and we have like it's a bigger space and a new neighborhood that I walk around.
Right.
Like outdoors, I don't feel as nervous. So I'm like, I'm walking around and exploring, and it's definitely like helped to have this change of scene, like my mental stability.
I think that's been a big challenge for everybody. I'm just wondering, like, do you have any advice for artists who are struggling? Because I've interviewed over 30 artists now, and some of them are being like, are able to produce, and then I have, some artists that I work with who are really struggling to find a way to reorient their brains. Like the disconnection has been too much for them. Too many patterns have changed. Too many things.
I think that you should just not like hold yourself accountable. I don't know what else to say because it's like I feel like we all have like I could be proud of myself for like being uber productive, but that's just the way my brain works and the way it's handling what's happening, and it's really nothing to be proud of. It's just like who I am.
Right.
And I think that if you're struggling, not to say that it's impossible to get over that or like to become productive through this, but like, and it's also like impossible for you to be like, oh, like I'm not going to hold it against yourself because that's who you are. But like that's the best thing I can think of. It's like we are who we are, and
acceptance
of yourself.
Yeah. I think I agree with you. Sometimes you have to clear away the mental dynamic of putting those pressures on yourself. I work pretty consistently, but people always say to me like, what is your deadline? Like what are you working against? And it's always me.
Yeah.
I'm the one who's putting the pressure on myself to accomplish something. I want to feel as though my time is meaningful, and I also have a little bit of a dark bent to it because I'm like, well, if I get COVID and I die, then I want there to be evidence that I was here as well.
I think that too. I'm like, I have a lot of paintings to make.
Right, yeah. I'm like, I'm not going around painting, viral cells and whatever.
It helps also that I live on the sale of my work.
Right.
So it's not like I had the luxury at any point to like
vacation.
Yeah, or to like, get depressed and not work. It's like, like in March was hard because that was like, it was just like I was freaking out, like the whole planet was.
Right.
And like that, it was harder to like concentrate because all I wanted to do was like see what's, update Twitter.
Right.
like or the New York Times all day long. But like after I got over my initial hump of paranoia, it's like it's I've been pretty productive.
The hardest part for me in this particular culture is when you say goodbye to everybody when you leave a room and stuff. And I'm Irish and we just leave we just like walk out of the space and nobody thinks anything of it. And I've offended so many people living here that I've had to get used to this idea of like formal goodbyes and
kisses for everybody.
Is it? Yeah. I'm like, okay, yes. I really appreciate you taking the time today to meet with us and show us your studio and your home. I know that it's a new space for you too, so it's hard to imagine what it's going to be like even in 6 months. But I appreciate your time, and your perspective is super unique, and I love hearing more about your work from the backside. So thank you so much for your time today.
Al contrario, thank you for coming and visiting. It's been really lovely.